It is 2:43 on Friday, the 11th of March, 2011. You are sitting at home with your two young children. In 3 minutes, your entire life as you know it will completely change forever. As the clock strikes 2:46 and 23 seconds, a magnitude 9 earthquake will hit your house and the northeastern coast of Japan. This is no ordinary earthquake, because it will be recorded as one of the 5 most powerful earthquakes in the world overall since modern record keeping began in 1900, and the largest to ever hit Japan. It will be so powerful that the island of Honshu will move 8 feet, 2.4 meters eastward, and sink almost 1 meter into the sea. You are watching your 2 young daughters playing with their dolls as you gaze out your second-story window thinking about what to make for dinner, when all of a sudden the ground beneath you starts to shake. It starts as a normal earthquake, and considering you are Japanese and have been living with earthquakes your whole life, you are not really concerned. But then something happens. It makes your heart stop, and a sound escapes from your lips in the form of a carnal scream of terror. The full force of a 9 magnitude that throws you off your feet. Your heart starts to pound in your chest as you try to comprehend what is happening. After a few seconds, your first thought is to find your children that have disappeared from your sight. You find them after searching for a few seconds in their room, screaming with terror, huddled together on the floor as the 9 continues to hammer you and your house. You think it is best to ride the shake out, as you have done 100 times before, but something inside of you tells you to get out of the house. You grab your children and run for the door. After 5 minutes, the shaking stops. Your children are still crying, but you feel that you have saved them from the worst. You then look and see your once beautiful house almost completely destroyed. You find it hard to comprehend the damage that your eyes are witnessing. You are in shock, so you sit there with your children on your lap. You are also crying hysterically because your mind has no way to understand what you have just experienced. As the minutes pass, you start to calm down and you make sure your children have not been hurt in the massive earthquake. You take another look at your house and decide you can go back inside to gather some clothing for your children and yourself, and then head to an evacuation shelter. You tell your children to stay put in the front yard, as there is broken glass everywhere, and you don't want them to get injured. Time passes by, and eventually you find yourself on the 2nd floor of your home in the children's bedroom, looking for clothing and maybe a few toys for the kids. You are crouched down to gather up a fluffy toy off the floor, when you start to hear a sound completely foreign to your ears. It sounds like a freight train, but much louder, and the ground starts to shake again. Immediately you think it is another earthquake, so you stand to run downstairs to get your children. You take a quick glance outside your 2nd-story window that faces the ocean and see a massive wave of water thundering towards your house. You are in shock and can't breathe. One last thought passes your mind. This is the end, and yourself and your children are dead. You are one of over 25,000 people to die on March the 11th, 2011, in Japan. Travelling from Miyako down to Sendai and visiting most of the towns ravaged by the earthquake and tsunami, not much has changed. The ground is still putrid smelling, and where once stood whole towns, now lay vacant patches of land. The cleanup is well underway. In most towns, if you stop to listen, you don't hear the birds at all, since all the trees are gone. All you hear are machines tearing and smashing walls to demolish those structures that once housed whole families. This story is not only about the damage and carnage that was inflicted by Mother Nature onto Japan, but more so to search out the survivors and hear their stories. Is it possible that strength, courage, and compassion still exists in this part of the world after losing everything, including family members? Miyako, loss of life, 401. Miyako is a fishing town that services most parts of Japan. The vision of the tsunami smashing into the town is some of the most broadcast around the world, with a black waterfall of water crashing over the seawall. Considering most houses in Japanese villages or small fishing towns are made from wood and are usually about 50 to 60 years old, older in some cases, the structures did not stand a chance when the wave came to shore. The town is still cleaning away the debris from the tsunami, and where once houses stood are now only concrete foundations. This scene will be repeated in all the towns down the coast. Miyako is a beautiful part of Japan, with amazing sweeping views of the harbor and surrounding mountains. But all this has now been replaced with a scene from an apocalyptic movie. There are still about 150 people living in the sports center. This acts as the town's emergency shelter, where they exist in their little spaces divided by cardboard walls. No privacy at all, and a very stressful situation, as they have no idea what their future holds. Mrs. Tanaka lives in the shelter with her 18-year-old daughter since she lost her mother and brother in the wave. She is waiting to move into a temporary home, which is a prefab building with 2 rooms, a kitchen and a bathroom. Her house was completely destroyed, so therefore she has the right to stay in the shelter. But her neighbor's house only had the ground floor damaged, and they are told they have to return to their home. There seems to be a double standard here, and she is very upset that this is the case. On March the 11th, Miyako became a town of haves and have-nots. Since one side of the street, the house was totally destroyed, but on the other, only a small amount of damage is visible. My mother committed a great sin by not trying to save herself and leave the house when the tsunami sirens went off. She was still inside when the wave crashed into the house and carried her away. I have only cried 3 times over the loss of my mother, said Mrs. Tanaka. Her brother's body has never been found. I feel very grateful for all the support from the various charities, and I am very hopeful my town can be rebuilt, not only with the houses, but also our fishing industry. But we don't want to eat the fish, because the fish ate us, she said. When the wave receded back to the ocean, it took hundreds of bodies with it, and there is now a belief that the fish ate the bodies of loved ones. Therefore, the people in this town do not want to consume the fish. Kamaishi, loss of life, approximately 1,250. The business district of this town was heavily hit, affecting most of all the businesses on the main street. Again, there is plenty of activity with the clearing of debris and the long, slow road of rebuilding the town. At the shelter, an old dilapidated gym, there are still 34 people waiting for temporary housing. At one stage, the shelter housed 127 families. One of the survivors is 76-year-old Mr. Ryaji. He still lives on the floor with no privacy along with his wife in the gym. I was at my house right behind this gym when the earthquake hit. I was surprised and went outside and saw clear water coming down the street towards our house. I called out to my wife to tell her something was wrong. Then, in 10 minutes or so, we were hit by a 3-meter tsunami. I climbed to the top of the roof, and while I was trying to pull my wife up, she was hit by a car floating on the tsunami, which ended up breaking her ankle. I managed to drag her up out of the rushing water, and we climbed into our next-door neighbour's house via an open window. After 30 minutes, the water was gone, and we came here to the shelter. We actually had a tsunami drill here in Kamaishi 3 days prior to the earthquake. It was held at 6 a.m., but only 45 people from the town attended, said Mr. Ryaji. Once Mr. Ryaji and his wife move into their temporary house, their food supply will be cut off. As with all the survivors, once you move from the shelter where you receive 3 meals a day and into a temporary house, you no longer receive food. It is part of the Japanese government's belief to encourage being self-sufficient. In the case of this particular shelter, it is also a matter of only 50 feet, since the gym and temporary houses are this distance apart. I cannot say a word about losing our food benefits. This is from the tax that my fellow Japanese countrymen have paid, and we cannot keep living on it. I received 1.5 million yen, which is approximately $20,000 US, for tsunami aid, so we can manage to live on this until we find something better, said Mr. Ryaji. This attitude of not wanting to rely upon their fellow Japanese was told many times down the coast. Even though the survivors have experienced great loss themselves, they are still very aware of the concerns of others and do not want to be a burden. Survivors enter a raffle for temporary housing. They have no choice of the location or the material the temporary house is built from. Some are plastic, where others are made of concrete. They are also expected to not only pay for their own meals, but also the utilities once they move in. There is one consideration given, however. They do not pay rent for up to 2 years. When the town is rebuilt, many want to start again at the same place as in the case of Mr. Ryaji's wife, who owned a bar that was heavily damaged in the tsunami. The owner of the building said he will rebuild better and stronger, and when it is complete, he wants me to start my bar again. I will do it without complaint and be grateful for this gift, said Mrs. Ryaji. Time and time again, the people most affected by this tragedy want to start again. They are committed to rebuilding their towns and return to a normal life the best way they can. Kamaishi Council expects the cleanup phase to take at least 3 years, with the town being fully rebuilt within 10 years. However, that is contradictory to what most other towns believe. In fact, the central government also state that the cleanup phase will take at least 10 years. As we are leaving the shelter, Mr. Ryaji came running out with food in his arms for our team, which he took from his own supply. We were not allowed to refuse his generosity for sake of insulting him, but it did show a sincere concern for us, since it was lunchtime and he wanted to make sure we had food. How do you explain such deep generosity from someone who has lost almost everything? When our team was almost out of the compound, Mr. Ryaji appeared again, but this time with a bottle of shochi, which is a traditional Japanese whiskey distilled from barley, sweet potato, or rice. Typically, it contains 25% alcohol. We accepted his gracious gift with very heavy hearts, and later that night, we toasted to his name. Earlier at the same shelter, we came across Mr. Shinpei Kikuchi, who is a professional photographer in Kamaishi. He lost his house and studio along with almost all of his photographic equipment in the tsunami. His daughter and wife also survived the earthquake and tsunami, and all are currently still living in the shelter, awaiting temporary housing. When the tsunami was coming into the town, I had my camera with me and I started to take shots. I had my wife and daughter only a couple of feet behind me, and as I turned around to shoot the wave coming towards us, my wife was swept up. My daughter and I ran towards the shelter on the hill, but I had no idea where my wife was, said Mr. Kikuchi. The wave had snatched his wife away, and she was only 5 feet behind her family. As she rode a 3-meter tsunami, she eventually landed on the roof of a house. This is where she was stranded for almost 3 hours. No one came to her rescue, so she decided to rescue herself. Jumping from the roof onto debris, she eventually made it to safety. After almost 7 hours, she was finally reunited with her family. Our neighbors across the street died in the tsunami, and our next-door neighbor, who was a handicap with only one leg, could not escape when the wave came in. A man came running out of nowhere and lifted our handicapped neighbor onto his back. The man could not run fast enough, and the wave caught up with them. They were both washed away. I found out later that our handicapped neighbor had died, but the man who carried him on his back was washed into a house and had a small pocket of air to breathe until he was rescued the next day, said Mrs. Kikuchi. This story of bravery is repeated thousands of times during that fateful day in March. After the wave hit Kamaishi and then retreated back to the sea, another warning was heard on the loudspeakers. This came from the city council that told the people to run for higher ground as quickly as possible. We thought another wave was coming. People from the city council told us to simply run to higher ground with no explanation why. We were told afterwards that the warning was due to a radiation scare. The council was convinced that the damaged Fukushima nuclear power plant was going to spew radiation onto the town, said Mr. Kikuchi. Mr. Kikuchi said he will rebuild his home and studio. He only has one camera left now, since his whole studio and equipment was completely destroyed. He faces a hard road ahead to support his family with his chosen profession as a professional, considering there is not much left to photograph. His house was not insured for tsunami damage. In fact, only 17% of all buildings in this town had some type of insurance, leaving a whopping 83% of the repair costs to be covered by the residents and building owners. When the tsunami hit the town, Mr. Kikuchi's oldest son and his wife had sought refuge at a temple on top of a hill. His son, who was an amateur photographer, had with him a camera and a zoom lens. He took a single picture of a house rooftop, and later when they developed the images, he could see his mother clinging to the roof. One more story from Kamaishi, as told by Mr. Kikuchi. In this image, you see a building, which is a high school. There is a car that balances dangerously outside one of the classrooms on the 3rd story. The teacher from this particular classroom died in the tsunami, and that car belongs to him. Minami-sanriku. Loss of life estimated at 10,000. Current status of this town wiped off the map. Minami-sanriku has experienced the greatest loss of life in all the towns along this coastline. Many of the residents still remember the last tsunami to hit this town back in 1960 that started its journey from Chile. With a height of nearly 8 feet, 2.4 meters, it devastated the town, killing more than 40 people. That tsunami cannot compare with the massive loss of life from the March 11th tsunami. When you drive into this town from the north, it takes you a matter of minutes for your senses to actually come to terms with what you are seeing or not seeing. There is nothing but a few buildings left that resembles a town that once had over 20,000 people living there. As the tsunami struck the town's disaster readiness center, there were 130 people working in that building. The mayor, Mr. Jin Sato, and 29 other council workers ran for the roof and watched as the town got completely inundated by a huge wave. Only 10 of the 30 people survived on the roof of that 3-story structure, as the others got washed away when the wave breached the roof. The remaining 120 in the building succumbed to the tsunami. Mr. Sato did not know the full extent of the loss of life until much later. Minami-sanriku lost over half its population, equaling over 10,000 people. On the hillside is a high school where over 7,000 people watched their town being washed away. This is also where the authorities decided to build the temporary houses. 86-year-old Mrs. Katsuko Sato is a survivor of 3 tsunamis and World War II. I have always lived by the sea. I have survived 3 tsunamis in this town already. I want to rebuild my home, but now I don't feel safe anymore by the ocean that I love. If I can rebuild, it will be on high ground, said Mrs. Sato. There are over 284 firefighters that lost their lives trying to save towns like this one all along the coastline. Most died while trying to close faulty sea gates. My grandson was a firefighter in this town, and he died along with 6 other crew members while trying to save the fire truck. They had also collected people along the way to try to take them to higher ground. They almost made it to the safe part of the hill, but the wave caught up with the truck, said Mrs. Sato. No one knows how many other people were also on that fire truck when it got consumed by the tsunami. Miki Endo was a council worker with the disaster prevention program run by the council. Miki was at her desk at the time the tsunami struck. Now what makes Miki special, and some refer to her as a heroine, is it was her voice that could be heard on the town's loudspeakers warning the residents to run to higher ground. Amateur footage shows the water rushing in, and the sound of her voice is clearly heard, warning people to run. Miki stayed at her desk right up until the end, when the building was eventually consumed by the wave, leaving only a skeleton of red steel framework. Miki's body was recovered 700 meters from the coast in Shizugawa Bay and identified through DNA. Miki was married only a year before. She is now hailed to have saved over 7,000 people. Shizugawa Hospital was one of the few major buildings to survive the tsunami in this town due to the concrete construction. At the time of the tsunami, it housed 109 patients plus staff. 74 patients and 3 staff members perished on that day, but 200 others managed to make it to the rooftop. Looking from the rooftop, you can see the entire town and the complete destruction the tsunami caused. It must have been terrifying for the people on the roof that day, as the building became an island in a sea as the water consumed it and the town around it. The wave reached the 3rd floor where the patients' rooms were. The 4th floor and roof are virtually intact. The town had 80 evacuation areas in case of a tsunami. Many people rushed to 2 of these centers, as instructed and rehearsed many times in the past. These particular centers were 20 meters above sea level, and at the time the tsunami hit, they were filled to capacity. The wave eventually inundated both centers, washing everyone away to their deaths. At the temporary housing complex, life is slowly returning to normal daily routines for the survivors. They have deliveries of fruit and supplies on a daily basis, with much of these goods donated by foreign charities. Children are running around laughing, and people have developed new friendships with other survivors. Most survivors did not know each other prior to the tragedy, but have now formed strong ties. They all share the same story, which gives them a unique bond. You can feel great strength talking to these people, knowing the loss they have experienced. They speak of a desire for a future, for a life beyond this tragedy. Rikuzentakata. Loss of life estimated at 1,000, with 1,300 still missing. Current status of this town, wiped off the map. As the tsunami approached the harbour, the automatic systems that would normally close the massive floodgates failed. Dedicated firemen realised this and they raced towards the gates to shut them manually. While attempting to do so and save the town, they were swept away to their deaths. A surviving volunteer firefighter said 49 firefighters were killed in this town by the tsunami. This situation perpetuated itself along the entire coastline, with harbour gates failing to close. Every building smaller than 3 stories high and not made of concrete in this town has been completely destroyed. The town's tsunami shelters were designed for a wave of 3 to 4 meters in height, but the tsunami of March 2011 in this town eclipsed that by several meters, which inundated the designated safe locations. 68 city officials, about 1/3 of the city's municipal employees, were killed. The town's mayor, Mr. Futoshi Toba, was at his desk at City Hall and survived. But his wife was killed at their seaside home. His job has now become much harder, considering he has to rebuild his town and mourn the loss of his wife at the same time. No people could be found in this town of 23,000 since the town no longer existed, and the total area is a wasteland ravaged by the sea and the fury of Mother Nature. All that is left are piles of debris that used to be the town. It is also very evident how the land has dropped because of the earthquake, due to the constant water on land that used to be dry. Outside of town, about 30 police rescue personnel searched for more than 1,300 missing people. The Defence Forces left, and now the job of body recovery is up to us, said one of the police officers. Looking at the faces of these young policemen, one can tell this is a very grave task demanded of them. They approach this as part of their duty and honour. Most of them know the people they are looking for, and one can only imagine the pain and psychological effect of finding a friend buried under piles of debris. It has now been many months after the earthquake and tsunami, so most bodies now have to be identified by DNA testing, considering not much is left, especially if the body has been in the water all this time. It has been reported that many rescue personnel now suffer from deep psychological scars from doing their duty of body recovery. All that is left of this town are the images I have taken. Rest in peace, Rikuzentakata. Ofunato. Loss of life approximately 127, with 120 still missing. This town has a history of tsunamis. The town is situated fairly close to an undersea volcano and suffers from frequent earthquakes of various scales. In 1896, the Minami-sanriku earthquake caused a 25-meter tsunami which killed 27,000 people. Then in 1933, the Sanriku earthquake, which had a magnitude of 8.4, killed over 1,500 people. Then on May the 22nd, in 1960, the city was hit again by a tsunami caused by the Valdivia earthquake in Chile. This Chile tsunami would cause massive damage down the east coast of Japan. Over the years, this town, like others along the Japanese coastline, had become more prepared against tsunamis, yet still there will always be great loss. Some say this is the risk of living in this beautiful country. Every day is a gift for the people of Japan, and this accounts for their great love of life that exists here. There is a deep passion for all things of the earth, and a tradition almost unequaled by any other country in the world. 3 months before the earthquake and tsunami that caused massive damage to this town, a man named Kamaishi Toda was elected the mayor. This would be his first foray into politics, since he had spent most of his life in the business world. The business he is a specialist in is construction. For over 36 years, he has held an executive position for various construction companies, spending a minimum of 20 of those overseas. A town could not wish for a better well-placed mayor than Mr. Toda, for he is very well aware of what is required to rebuild his town. We had just started a council meeting when the earthquake struck our town. I immediately organized the earthquake alarms in town and set up the emergency council. While we were in the emergency council chambers, we saw on the TV that a tsunami was heading towards our town. We then rushed to the roof of our building, which is situated on the hillside overlooking the town, and we saw it. My heart sank when I saw what the tsunami was doing to my people and my town. My head went white, and I was in shock, said Mr. Toda. Soon after, Mr. Toda realized the full extent of the damage, and something kicked in, his lifelong career in construction. He became aware of the extent of the damage and started working through the needs of his people early. Since he is well aware of what is required to rebuild his town, he has become an example for other mayors. He estimates his town needs over 300 billion yen, over $30 billion to rebuild. His main concern right now is the central government's delaying tactics, since they hold the necessary funds. The government cannot seem to get it right and place all the cards on the table at once. Therefore, my town continues to suffer. I have implemented certain procedures that I believe will rebuild this town as fast as possible. I have negotiated with the car manufacturers to take back their damaged vehicles, as well as other manufacturers for refrigerators, TVs, washing machines, and so on. This will save our town money and also promote recycling, he said. Just out of town are huge piles of these destroyed items he speaks of, waiting for the particular manufacturers to collect and recycle them. It all seems very well organized, which is the typical Japanese trait. For families that have lost their main income provider, the Red Cross provides 2.5 million yen. The Ofunato City Council will also provide money. There is also a Japanese law that provides 5 million yen to these families. The mayor of Ofunato is a strong man that is not a career politician, which leaves this town in probably the best position of any of the towns to rebuild the fastest, considering his knowledge in the construction industry. Kesennuma. Loss of life, approximately 837, with 1,196 still missing. This town has a monumental task ahead of it. It is one of the larger towns to be affected by the tsunami, and there is still plenty of water around the streets. It is slowly becoming famous as the town with the big boats on the streets that the tsunami picked up and deposited. While walking through town, you are struck with a putrid smell of festering still water that sits in large pools. The town's landmass dropped by nearly 1 meter, and the water is not going away anytime soon. There is even more water bubbling up from under the ground, as the area has still not settled after the earthquake. It took less than 7 minutes to wipe out the commercial port district of this town when the wave came in. The city was Japan's busiest port for processing bonito and swordfish, and the fishing industry has been decimated due to the tragedy of March 11. And it was here that we met a real-life hero, Mr. Yuji Ando. Mr. Ando owns a fish distribution plant that employs 12 workers. I was near the water when the earthquake struck. Knowing the sea as I do, my first thought was a possible tsunami. But when I noticed dolphins beaching themselves, I knew we were in trouble. I raced back to my business and I found all the women crying hysterically and the men standing around doing nothing. I immediately ordered the women to go across the road and go to the top floor of a concrete parking structure that stands about 6 stories high. I then ordered the men to get into all of our delivery trucks and drive them to the same parking structure. They asked me why I wanted them to do this, and I told them one word: tsunami. We managed to save all the staff and every vehicle. I was standing on the top of the parking structure with my video camera at the ready, thinking I would be filming something amazing, when all of a sudden I remembered I still had my children at the school across town. Considering I had ordered all the vehicles to the roof, all I had left was a bicycle. So I pedaled as fast as I could across town, about 3 kilometers, to the kids' school and got them to safe ground. As I was pedaling back to the business, the wave was rushing towards me. I had to now save myself, so I climbed onto a concrete building and watched as the wave completely destroyed my town, said Mr. Ando. The 12 employees ended up sleeping the night in the parking structure because the town had been washed away and the streets were impassable. I finally made my way back to the parking structure the next morning with food for my employees and to rescue them, said Mr. Ando. Mr. Ando is still running his business, but the original building that housed it was partially destroyed, so he built another one next door. He still employs his 12 staff and is struggling to make ends meet. Soon after the tragedy, he printed up T-shirts for all his staff that had the name of the town and the words "Never Give Up" across the front. He is now told by the council that he cannot keep his business in the same place since they are going to widen the road, and the original building next door that he owns will be torn down. His brother and family live on the second floor of that building. We are getting no assistance from the local council or the government to help get our fishing industry up and running again. The responsibility is then up to us. Our town survives on this industry, and it is very hard to hear our elected politicians say there is nothing they can or will do to help us, considering 85% of all jobs are related to this industry in our town, said Mr. Ando. During our interview, he was joined by his wife and young son, who were also wearing inspirational T-shirts. One gets the distinct impression that this hero is a very special individual that possessed a clear head when all those around him were losing theirs. Further along the port, 3 fishermen were tending to their boat that survived the onslaught of the tsunami. We were out at sea with a flotilla of boats at the time the wave hit. We were about 4 kilometers out when we saw a huge swell coming towards us. The wave had not broken yet, but we all knew immediately that something was very wrong. Our boat was facing away from the wave, and we had only about 30 seconds to turn it around so we could ride over it. It was a very tense time as the boat turned around, because if we had been hit on the broadside, it would have capsized us. We made the turn and must have risen 9 meters while riding over the swell. We then immediately radioed our head office in town to warn them of the approaching tsunami. We had not felt the earthquake since we were at sea at the time, but we figured there must have been a big one to generate this size tsunami. We did not receive any replies from head office. And it was not until we returned to the town that we found out our office had been completely destroyed by the earthquake. After riding over the wave safely, most of the boats turned around and steamed back to port, since we have families in Kesennuma, and we were very concerned. When we finally came back to port, we could not believe the sight we saw. It was very hard for us to navigate through all the debris floating in the port, especially the trees. There was a pine plantation near the port that had over 90,000 trees, but now only one stood, as the rest was now in the port floating out to sea, said Mr. Onodera, the captain of the boat. In fact, most of the boats that survived that day were tuna boats, since they were all at sea at the time the earthquake and tsunami struck. These fishermen are struggling to survive, but there is a definite sense of solidarity between these men as they posed for our pictures. Big smiles, big laughs, big hearts. That's what you get from a Kesennuma fisherman. After the tsunami hit Kesennuma, Fuel that was spilt from the town's fishing boats caught fire and burned for 4 days solid with no one to put them out. This is why you see so much fire damage in this town. Around the town are bulldozers and graders that are clearing the land. They also remove the piles of debris strewn everywhere. At each pile of debris stands a single police officer with a long stick in hand, ready to search for bodies or body parts. Ishinomaki. In the event of an earthquake, your first thought as a loving, concerned parent would be to drive to the school your child is in and make sure they are okay. This idea occurred to hundreds of parents who did exactly that on March 11. They reached the local high school and parked their cars at the front. No orderly parallel parking, just park where they could, and run into the school to find their children. No one thought that by this one action would cause a massive disaster. The wave would not only reach the school, but eventually caused the cars to explode and set fire to the high school, causing the death of several people, as evident by the wreath of flowers sitting at the front burnt-out steps. Most of the students escaped out the back door to higher ground, where they would witness the destruction of their part of Ishinomaki. Over 3,000 people died in this town, making it one of the worst losses of life on March 11. There is still a great sense of sadness while walking around this part of town where the high school sits on the hill. Almost every structure is gone. I found a 2-story house that survived the earthquake and tsunami. I say survived, meaning it was still standing. Venturing in, I found most of the front facade missing and ripped away by the wave. Upstairs were the children's bedrooms with toys and stuffed animals strewn all over the floor. The children's bunk beds had been damaged, and life stopped the moment the wave reached the second floor. Finding a photo album, I discovered there were 3 daughters, and my first thoughts were, did this family get out in time? There was no evidence that they ever came back to the house to collect personal belongings, since many were still lying on the floor. Most of the survivors I spoke to along this coastline have not gone back to their homes. They do not want to relive the terrifying experience all over again, and some don't wish to see what has become of their cherished houses. All of the large areas of vacant land in Ishinomaki are now filled with debris. The local council assigned certain areas for different material, with steel over here and wood over there. The Japanese efficiency is always evident while dealing with this tragedy. There is an island in Ishinomaki that has a copy of a statue given to the Americans by the French back in October 28, 1886. She is supposed to represent freedom to an oppressed people. This particular copy of the Statue of Liberty was the first man-made structure to be hit by the wave that visited the town on March 11th. Next to the statue is a church that also took the full brunt of the wave, but somehow withstood the full force of Mother Nature. When Lions International donated the sign that sits outside the church, someone failed to place the letter E at the end of the word peace. A very strange collection of man-made symbols are placed in a very small area of land here. That island now gets flooded daily since the land has dropped. As the tide comes in, the island becomes inundated with water, and the local police have to send out patrols to move people away to safety. This has now become part of their daily routine. Ishinomaki would be the staging ground for a candle vigil for 10,000 people lost on March the 11th. Is it 10,000, 15,000, 30,000? It is very hard to get accurate figures, but for one night in this town they sent 10,000 candles down the river. Monks said their prayers and the people had a chance to mourn once again the loss of loved ones and fellow Japanese. Even Mickey Mouse made an appearance in a parade down the main street to the pleasure of hundreds of small children. This town and all the other towns along this ravaged coastline are desperately trying to get back on their feet. In all the towns visited, people of great inner strength were found, inspirational individuals that refuse to roll over and die, people that want to continue to live and hope for a better future. As a professional photographer, I took this assignment knowing that I had to keep my emotions in check. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. I found that I became emotionally involved with everything that was happening in this part of the country. And in fact, it was after meeting amazing people like Mr. Ando, which I wear his shirt with a great sense of pride and feel very privileged to have met this amazing individual. In fact, I'm feeling emotional now just talking about it again, and especially after spending so much time editing up this piece for you to have a look at. One of the most important things that I discovered in my journey up north is the need of the people. Now, I know that there are lots of survivors and groups and charity organizations that are going north, and God love them, they do sacrifice a lot and they do a wonderful job. The need of the people I'm talking about are the ones that are either still in the shelters or have been moved to temporary housing. Their need is love. It's an amazing thing to discover. It's not so much a house, it's not so much another car or a job or money. These are individuals that have lost members of their family. And you can feel this great emptiness when you look in their eyes. I actually would implore those that are watching this, if you live in Japan or you're from some other country in the world, please go up there and visit. See these people. If you find one of these survivors, give them a hug. Let them know that they're not alone. Also too, these areas are desperate. They need funds. They need people to visit them, even if it's just for a day, for a couple of days. Most of these areas are only less than 2 hours north of Tokyo. With a population of over 20 million people in the city, go up and see them. Spend money in their areas. They can't do it by themselves. And the central government is just not acting fast enough. Especially, I think, if you're a Japanese person watching this right now. Your next holiday, go and visit a town. Buy an ice cream. It's still money that you're putting into that part of the country that is desperate for help. One other thing that I wanted to share with you. When I got back from my trip, I had managed to keep most of it in. That's the emotions. I got to my house and I sat down on my stoop and I broke down. I lost it, as I am doing now. I'm sorry. I looked down at my shoes and I saw the dirt that had accumulated on them the whole time that I was on this trip. And I realized that I'd walked through sacred ground. Where people had died and passed away, women, children. This dirt had accumulated on the bottom of my shoes. After I'd gathered myself, I went into the kitchen and got a container. And I scraped the dirt from the shoes into the container and took it upstairs to where my office is, put it next to my computer, and wrote this story. I've since planted the dirt in my back garden and put a tree there and it'll grow. Thank you for watching. One last thing. The power to pass this story on is now in your hands. In the days that we live in of the internet, one click, you can pass it on. You can tell everybody, the whole world, what's still happening in Japan. The media is forgotten, but we haven't. We live here. And those poor wretched souls, those innocent lives, they're still living that every single day. Please, I implore you, pass the story on, share it, remind the world.